You never forget the moments that shift the air in a room, the silence so sharp it cuts through laughter, the pause that makes time crawl. That night, in an upscale restaurant gleaming with polished marble and crystal chandeliers, a single whispered word cracked the illusion of superiority that money so often buys. A millionaire, wrapped in his own sense of invincibility, thought he held the stage. He mocked, smirked, and spoke in a language he assumed no one around him could understand. Yet across the table, the young black waitress who had been invisible in his eyes leaned closer, bent slightly, and let one word slip in flawless Mandarin. One word. That was all it took for his smile, arrogant, smug, untouchable, to vanish. Before I unravel how it happened, let me pause right here. If stories like this grab you, where arrogance collides with truth, where people underestimated rise in ways no one saw coming, then you're in the right place. Take a second, hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Trust me, you'll want to be part of this journey, because what starts as a simple dinner scene spirals into something much deeper. A lesson about power, respect, and the hidden strength people carry within them. Now let's step back. To understand the gravity of that whispered word, you need to understand the setting, the man, and the woman who shattered his mask. He was the kind of millionaire who carried his wealth like a shield. You know, the type, sharp suit tailored within an inch of perfection, a gold watch heavy enough to bend his wrist, a voice that filled space not because it was loud, but because he expected everyone else to shrink around it. He had built his fortune in tech or finance, or some world where numbers replaced faces and people were reduced to profit margins. Wherever he went, he expected service, deference, and admiration, not because of who he was, but because of what he had. And then there was her, the waitress. She wasn't just carrying plates and pouring wine. She was carrying years of untold battles. She was a woman who had grown up navigating spaces where her very existence was second-guessed. Her skin, her accent, her place in the world, constantly measured, constantly judged. But here's the thing. Life had taught her resilience in silence. She had a reservoir of strength hidden behind polite smiles and quiet steps. She had something the millionaire couldn't buy: depth. That night, she had been moving from table to table with a kind of grace that most people overlooked. To the guests, she was just part of the furniture of luxury, a shadow flitting by to refill a glass or clear a dish. But she saw everything. The way couples leaned in too close when secrets dripped between them, the way deals were sketched out on napkins, the way pride clung to men who thought the world revolved around their appetites. When she reached his table, the millionaire didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a target. He was speaking with his companions, slipping into Arabic at first, tossing around jokes that were cruel in nature, hiding them behind the shield of a foreign tongue. But arrogance makes people sloppy. He assumed she didn't understand, assumed her silence was ignorance. When he shifted from Arabic to Mandarin, his own clumsy version of it, he aimed his jokes at her directly, disguising them in words he thought were safe. His smile widened as his friends laughed, and he leaned back in his chair as though the room belonged to him. But the waitress didn't flinch. Inside, something stirred. She had heard worse before, but tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying years of microaggressions. Maybe it was the quiet fire of dignity refusing to be smothered. Whatever it was, she knew she couldn't let this one pass. And so she leaned closer, her voice low, her lips barely moving, and whispered one word. One word in Mandarin so sharp, so perfectly placed, it sliced through the millionaire's facade. His smile froze, then cracked, then fell. His friends, confused, looked between them. The room, once filled with chatter and clinking glasses, seemed to wait for what would come next. That was the moment, the turning point. A single word, spoken not with anger but with precision, stripped the millionaire of the one thing he valued most: control. And as his smile disappeared, what remained wasn't power. It was fear. The millionaire's laughter didn't just fade. It shattered. It was as if the sound had been yanked out of him, leaving a hollow silence in its place. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickered, and for the first time that evening he looked small. You know that moment when someone realizes they're no longer the smartest person in the room? That flash of panic when their mask slips, and all that's left is raw insecurity? That's what painted itself across his face. The other men at the table, dressed in suits just as sharp as his, leaned forward, waiting for an explanation. They didn't know what the word meant. They only saw the shift, the sudden, undeniable change in their friend who usually commanded every room he entered. It wasn't just confusion. It was the weight of watching someone they admired stumble. The waitress didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't even linger. She straightened her back and walked away as though nothing had happened. Her tray balanced effortlessly in her hands. To the rest of the restaurant, she was invisible again, a shadow sliding between tables. But in truth, she had just rewritten the entire script of the evening. What was that word? Why did it matter so much? To understand, you'd need to know her story. She hadn't grown up with privilege, not even close. Her earliest memories were stitched together with sounds of multiple languages. Her grandmother's soft lullabies in Yoruba, her neighbor's Spanish arguments through thin apartment walls, the Mandarin lessons from a community center tutor who saw something bright in her curious eyes. Her mother had cleaned offices at night, her father had worked double shifts in warehouses, and she had absorbed everything. The weight of sacrifice, the necessity of resilience, the unspoken demand to rise above without ever being invited. While other kids played, she studied. Languages became her escape, her rebellion, her superpower. Every new word she learned was a key, unlocking doors the world wanted to keep closed to her. By the time she was a teenager, she could switch between English, French, Spanish, and Mandarin with an ease that startled even her teachers. Yet outside the classroom, people still saw her the same way. Just another black girl in a city that didn't value her brilliance. Working at the restaurant wasn't her dream. It was a survival tactic. Bills didn't care about potential and dreams didn't pay rent. But what no one realized, least of all arrogant millionaires, was that every night she worked, she sharpened a hidden blade. She listened, absorbed, and waited. She collected the careless words people threw into the air when they thought no one understood them. So when the millionaire mocked her in Mandarin, he thought he was clever. He thought he was untouchable. What he didn't know was that she had been preparing for men like him her entire life. The word she whispered wasn't random. It was chosen with precision, a word that cut deeper than a curse ever could. It wasn't just about language. It was about striking a nerve he thought no one could see. Because here's the truth. People reveal themselves in the languages they don't expect you to know. They hide their cruelty in syllables they think are safe. But the moment you respond in their tongue, you flip the balance. You tell them, I see you, I understand you, and you can't hide anymore. The millionaire knew exactly what that word meant. It was personal. It pierced straight into the armor he had built around himself. That's why his smile disappeared. Because arrogance thrives on the illusion of superiority, and in a single breath, she had destroyed it. As he sat there, his friends whispering questions he couldn't answer, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Exposed, vulnerable, powerless. And isn't it strange? For all his millions, for all his influence, it only took one waitress with one whispered word to remind him that money can't buy respect. She walked back to the kitchen, her heart steady. She hadn't done it to humiliate him. She hadn't done it for applause or recognition. She did it because sometimes silence isn't strength, it's surrender. And she wasn't about to surrender anymore. In that moment, the restaurant became more than a place of luxury. It became a battlefield of dignity, and she had claimed her ground without raising her voice. The millionaire, meanwhile, was left with a choice. He could pretend it didn't matter, laugh it off, and continue his evening. Or he could confront the reality that the world didn't bend to him the way he believed it did. And the longer he sat there, the more he realized this wasn't just about a word. It was about a mirror being held up to his face, showing him the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. And that's when the story began to turn. Because what started as a moment of arrogance meeting resistance would soon unravel into something neither of them could have expected. The clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of background chatter returned to the restaurant. But for the table in the corner, time had slowed. The millionaire sat frozen, his fingers drumming against the stem of his wine glass, as though rhythm alone could keep him composed. His friends chuckled uneasily, trying to pick up the conversation again, but the air around him was heavy. They didn't understand the word she had spoken, but they knew enough to sense that something had shifted. An invisible line crossed, an ego punctured. He tried to force a laugh, to shrug it off, but his throat caught. It was strange. Here was a man who had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, stared down competitors, and delivered speeches to packed auditoriums. Yet one soft whisper from a waitress had left him scrambling for footing. He picked up his fork, then set it back down, picked up his glass, then left it untouched. His hands betrayed what his face was trying to conceal. He was rattled. His companions leaned in. "What did she say?" one of them asked, lowering his voice. The millionaire waved it off, muttering something about just a silly word. But the lie didn't land. The waitress's voice had carried weight, and they had all felt it, even without translation. They could see it in his eyes, the crack in his armor. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, she moved as though nothing had happened. Plates clattered, orders were shouted, steam rose from simmering pans, and she wove through it all with practiced grace. But beneath the calm exterior, her mind replayed the moment, not with regret, but with clarity. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lashed out, hadn't lost herself. She had simply spoken truth into the space where arrogance thought it reigned unchecked. And truth, when spoken at the right time, has a way of echoing louder than any insult. Back at the table, the millionaire felt cornered. He couldn't explain what happened without admitting what he had said. To confess the meaning of that word was to reveal that he had been mocking her, degrading her in a tongue he assumed she couldn't understand. To admit it would strip away his carefully curated image of sophistication. So he sat in silence, his companions filling the void with strained laughter and forced stories. Yet he barely heard them. His mind kept circling back to that single syllable, the sharpness of her pronunciation, the way it carried not just knowledge but authority. It wasn't just the word itself, it was what it represented. For years, he had believed languages were tools, exotic ornaments he could use to impress or exclude. He collected phrases like trophies, showing them off in boardrooms and cocktail parties. He had always been the one to control the narrative. But tonight, the balance had flipped. She hadn't spoken to impress. She had spoken to reveal. And the revelation was this. His words weren't as private as he thought. His cruelty hadn't been hidden. He wasn't as clever as he believed. The more he thought about it, the more the humiliation burned. He remembered being a young man, mocked himself for stumbling over English idioms in a foreign university. He had buried those memories beneath layers of success, turning insecurity into arrogance. But the waitress's whisper had unearthed them, dragging them back into the light. He hated the feeling, not just because it exposed his fragility, but because it reminded him of who he really was before the money, before the power. And he despised that version of himself. At another table nearby, a couple noticed the tension. They whispered about how the millionaire's face had drained of color, about how the waitress seemed unfazed. Wordless ripples spread across the restaurant, not through gossip but through intuition. People didn't know the details, but they felt the imbalance. There's a certain energy when arrogance is checked, when dignity rises quietly against condescension. People sense it even if they don't have the full story. The waitress returned with fresh plates, setting them down with steady hands. She didn't look at him longer than necessary, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. It wasn't attraction, it was obsession, the way a wounded animal watches the one who cornered it. He wanted to reclaim control, to find a way to diminish her, but the words wouldn't come. How do you belittle someone who's already proven she sees right through you? His friends tried to toast, lifting their glasses with exaggerated cheer, but even that rang hollow. The millionaire forced a smile, but everyone at the table knew it was counterfeit. A fracture had appeared, and no amount of wealth could plaster over it. The night stretched on, courses arriving one after another, but the taste had soured. The millionaire's appetite was gone. Each time the waitress walked past, his chest tightened. He feared she might say more, expose him further, strip away the last scraps of superiority he clung to. But she didn't. She moved on, attending to other tables, leaving him alone with his unraveling. And that was the cruelest twist of all. She didn't need to do anything else. She had already won. What he didn't yet realize was that the words she had spoken carried layers he hadn't even begun to unpack. It wasn't just a personal jab. It was a mirror, a challenge, and a revelation all in one. And the longer he sat there, the more it would gnaw at him, until the man who walked into the restaurant that night was no longer the man who walked out. The longer the evening dragged on, the more the millionaire felt as if he were suffocating inside his own skin. The laughter at nearby tables grated on him. The clinking of silverware felt too sharp, and every flicker of candlelight cast shadows that seemed to mock his unease. He shifted in his seat, tugged at his cufflinks, adjusted his tie. All the little gestures of a man trying to rebuild a facade that had already crumbled. His friends noticed. Of course they did. These were men who had followed him for years, basking in his charisma, emulating his confidence, feeding off his arrogance as though it were fuel. Tonight, for the first time, they saw the cracks. One of them leaned closer, dropping his voice. "Come on, what was it she said? You're not usually this shaken." The millionaire forced a smirk, swirling the wine in his glass as though he were perfectly in control. "Nothing. Just a misunderstanding," he muttered. But the lie hung in the air, fragile and transparent. They knew it wasn't nothing. They knew because they had seen his smile disappear, watched his posture collapse, felt the tension coil around the table like smoke. The waitress returned again, refilling water glasses with quiet efficiency. She didn't glance at him, didn't acknowledge his presence beyond the basic courtesy of her job. Yet somehow, her silence was louder than any insult. It was unbearable, because she wasn't playing his game. She wasn't scrambling for approval, wasn't trying to please him. She was simply existing, calm, steady, dignified, and in her presence, his power seemed to wither. He remembered the word again, just one syllable, but it echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't even shouted. It was worse than that. It was deliberate, precise, impossible to twist into anything other than what it was. And he hated that his friends were looking at him, silently demanding answers he couldn't give. Another companion laughed nervously, raising his glass. "Come on, man. You're usually the one making the room laugh. You've been sitting there like you've seen a ghost." The millionaire's hand tightened on his fork. A ghost. That's exactly what it felt like. That word had resurrected parts of himself he had buried long ago. Memories of being dismissed, underestimated, laughed at for his stumbles in foreign classrooms, treated as though he didn't belong. He had sworn he'd never feel that way again, had built an empire on top of those wounds. Yet tonight, a waitress had peeled it all back with a single breath. And the strangest part? No one else in the restaurant knew what had happened, but everyone could feel the shift. Energy has a way of moving through a room, unseen but undeniable. Diners who had been engrossed in their meals now stole glances at the corner table. They couldn't articulate why, but they sensed a power struggle had unfolded. One not of wealth or status, but of dignity. The waitress's colleagues in the kitchen had noticed too. They whispered between orders, curious about why their coworker seemed calmer than usual, her steps even lighter. They didn't know what she had said, but they saw in her a quiet confidence that hadn't been there at the start of the shift. For years, she had learned to make herself small, to carry the weight of insults with a smile. But tonight, she had chosen something different. And once you choose dignity over silence, it changes you. The millionaire couldn't bear it any longer. He excused himself from the table, muttering something about needing fresh air, and slipped out to the dimly lit patio. The night air hit his face, cool and sharp, but it didn't soothe him. He leaned against the stone railing, staring at the city lights, trying to steady his breathing. His friends remained inside, exchanging puzzled looks, their laughter now forced and brittle. Out on the patio, he replayed the moment in his mind over and over. The smirk on his lips before she spoke, the hush that followed after, the sting of realizing he wasn't untouchable. He hated it. He hated her for exposing it, hated himself for caring, hated the truth that no matter how much money he made, there would always be people who saw right through him. And yet, beneath the hatred, something else stirred, something he couldn't name, a faint whisper of respect, maybe, or fear, because the word she had chosen wasn't meant to humiliate. He knew that. It was meant to confront, to remind him that cruelty leaves a trail, that arrogance is always more transparent than it thinks. And though he wanted to dismiss it, bury it, laugh it off, he couldn't. When he finally returned to the table, his friends tried to lighten the mood with stories and jokes, but the dynamic had shifted for good. He wasn't leading anymore. He wasn't the center of attention. He was just a man haunted by a word, trying to pretend it hadn't pierced him deeper than any insult ever could. Meanwhile, the waitress carried on. She didn't need to look back to know he was unraveling. She had felt it the moment his smile cracked. And while he tried to rebuild himself in front of his friends, she kept moving forward, knowing that the smallest acts of defiance often echo the loudest. The night wasn't over yet, but the balance of power had already changed, and the millionaire knew it. Inside the restaurant, the glow of chandeliers still shimmered across wine glasses, but the mood at the corner table had turned brittle. The millionaire sat stiff, his back straighter than usual, his smile tighter, his laughter hollow. His friends tried to carry on, tossing out stories and jokes as if they could smooth over the crack that had formed in the evening. But no matter how many glasses of wine they lifted, they couldn't shake the strange weight that lingered around them. The man they knew, their leader, their model of confidence, wasn't there anymore. In his place was someone distracted, uneasy, glancing toward the kitchen as though afraid of another blow. His silence was louder than their chatter, and it made them restless. One friend finally leaned in, lowering his voice. "You're not yourself tonight. What happened?" The millionaire forced a laugh, but it was brittle like glass about to shatter. "I told you it was nothing, just a word. She doesn't matter." But even as he said it, he felt the lie scrape against his throat. Because she did matter. She mattered more than he wanted to admit. That single word had lodged itself in his chest like a thorn, and no amount of denial could dislodge it. Across the room, the waitress moved with the same quiet grace she had carried all evening. She wasn't watching him, wasn't plotting a victory, wasn't basking in the moment. To her, it was simple. She had defended her dignity and moved on. But to him, and now to his friends, she was no longer invisible. Every step she took was a reminder of the moment he had lost control. Every time she passed by, his friends' eyes flickered toward her, as though they were silently asking, what power does she hold over him? And that's where the fracture deepened. Because his friends didn't admire weakness. They admired dominance, wit, the ability to turn any situation into a stage for his charisma. But tonight, he had been checked, and not by a rival CEO or a powerful investor, but by a waitress they would have dismissed as irrelevant. The fact that she had shaken him was unthinkable, and yet undeniable. One of them tried to make light of it. "You're letting this girl get under your skin, man. Come on, it's just a waitress." The millionaire snapped faster than he intended. "She's not just anything." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and the table fell silent. His friends exchanged glances, raising eyebrows at the intensity in his voice. He realized his mistake immediately, took another sip of wine to mask it, and leaned back in his chair. But it was too late. They had seen the truth. He was rattled, and he couldn't hide it. Meanwhile, the waitress was unaware of the storm brewing behind her. She carried plates, balanced trays, listened to the clipped orders of the head chef, and kept her focus steady. Yet deep inside, she felt something new stirring. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was strength. For years she had endured small humiliations, brushed them off, told herself it wasn't worth fighting. But tonight proved something to her, that a single moment of courage could shift the weight of an entire room. And others had felt it too. A couple sitting nearby had whispered to each other about the way the millionaire had frozen when she spoke. The bartender had raised an eyebrow when he noticed the unusual tension. The energy had spread like a ripple in water, subtle but undeniable. Without realizing it, she had become a symbol in that space. Proof that arrogance could be disarmed not with shouting, but with truth spoken at the right time. The millionaire, however, was far from finished with the evening. He tried to recover, steering the conversation toward business, investments, the markets, his usual terrain of control. But the more he talked, the more forced it sounded. His friends humored him, but the spark wasn't there. The unspoken question hung between them. Why did one word shake him this badly? He kept glancing toward the kitchen, almost against his will. He wanted to confront her, to reclaim some sense of superiority, to remind her of her place. But deep down, he knew that no confrontation could undo what had already happened. Once a mask slips, it can't be restored, it can only be replaced. And he didn't yet know what to replace his with. By the time dessert arrived, his friends had grown quiet too. The chatter had died down, replaced with the clinking of spoons and the occasional strained laugh. The millionaire sat in the middle of it all, his mind elsewhere, his thoughts circling like vultures. He hated how much space she occupied in his head. He hated that he couldn't stop hearing the word, replaying the tone, dissecting the intent. It wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was about something deeper. The realization that for all his power, all his wealth, there were truths he couldn't escape, languages he couldn't own, and people he couldn't control. And as much as he tried to bury that realization, it kept rising louder each time. Maybe the empire he had built wasn't as solid as he thought. Maybe the foundation he stood on could be shaken by anyone brave enough to speak. The next morning, the city buzzed with its usual chaos. Traffic horns, hurried footsteps, and the chatter of 1,000 overlapping conversations formed a messy soundtrack to urban life. But inside the diner, there was a silence thick enough to cut. People who knew what had happened the previous night whispered to each other, replaying every detail. To them, the waitress had done something more than just defend herself. She had flipped a social hierarchy upside down with a single, precise move. But for the waitress herself, the night's confrontation wasn't about winning a battle of pride. It was about reclaiming her dignity, Something she had learned long ago was rarely handed to people like her. You see, she had grown up navigating multiple worlds. One where she was seen as too black to belong. Another where she was dismissed as too poor to matter. And yet another where her sharp mind and quiet intelligence went unnoticed because she wasn't born into privilege. It was in this layered identity that she discovered languages. Every word she learned in Mandarin, Spanish, French, or Arabic wasn't just vocabulary, it was armor. Armor against the smirks of men like the Millionaire. Armor against the disbelief of strangers who looked at her apron and assumed her voice carried no weight. And perhaps most importantly, armor against the temptation to believe the lie that she was less than anyone else. The Millionaire, on the other hand, couldn't let it go. His smile hadn't just disappeared that night. It had fractured into 1,000 insecurities he had spent years hiding behind wealth. Money had always been his mask. It let him walk into rooms expecting respect, even when he hadn't earned it. But in a moment, one word from a waitress had stripped that mask away. He found himself replaying her voice in his mind, sharp and melodic in a language he thought belonged to him, to his world, to people who looked nothing like her. For the first time in a long while, he felt small. And that's the thing, isn't it? Respect can't be bought. Status doesn't guarantee it. True respect, the kind that lingers long after the applause fades, is earned. Sometimes, it's earned by those society least expects, by someone pouring coffee at midnight, holding onto their quiet strength until the exact moment it needs to roar. This wasn't just about language anymore. It was about perception. A single word, spoken fluently in Mandarin, carried more power than all his millions could buy. And that's what haunted him. But the waitress? She didn't walk away feeling victorious. She walked away reminded of something deeper. Power reveals itself not in shouting or in wealth but in timing. Knowing when to speak. Knowing how to let silence do the heavy lifting. And when the time came, she didn't just speak. She whispered. Because whispers, when chosen carefully, can echo louder than screams. And so, the story spread not because people loved gossip, but because they sensed something universal in it. It wasn't just a waitress versus a millionaire. It was a reminder that the underestimated always hold a card the world forgets about. That the smile of arrogance can vanish in a heartbeat when truth, sharpened by courage, decides to show itself. The millionaire couldn't sleep. The image of her face, calm and unwavering, and that one whispered word in Mandarin kept him restless through the night. He wasn't used to losing control of a room, let alone to someone he considered beneath him. For decades, his money had bought silence, compliance, and admiration. Yet here he was, pacing his penthouse floor, replaying the moment like a glitch in his otherwise flawless performance of power. What stung the most wasn't the word itself. It was what it represented. It meant she had understood him all along, understood his arrogance in its purest form, and waited. She hadn't rushed to defend herself. She hadn't lashed out in English, the language he expected. No, she had studied his weapon, dismantled it, and then struck back with precision. He wasn't humiliated because she shouted, he was humiliated because she whispered. The next day, he tried to drown the memory in routine. Board meetings, phone calls, lavish lunches with people who laughed too loudly at his jokes. But it didn't work. Every time he glanced at someone's smile, he saw her, the waitress who had taken his smile away with nothing more than breath and syllables. And so, against his own instincts, he returned to the diner. Not for food, not for coffee, but for answers. She noticed him the moment he walked in. His suit was the same shade of confidence he always wore, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted around, restless, unsure. For the first time, he looked like a man without armor. He sat down quietly, no entourage, no booming voice announcing his presence. Just him. When she walked to his table, she didn't offer a smile, didn't even ask what he wanted. She simply stood, pen and notepad in hand, waiting. Finally, he leaned forward and said, almost in a whisper himself, "Where did you learn Mandarin?" The question wasn't about curiosity, it was about control. He wanted to reclaim something, to understand how she had slipped through the cracks of his assumptions. She didn't flinch. "I learned it the same way you probably learned to look down on people, by paying attention." The words landed heavier than he expected. For a moment, he had no comeback, no clever retort. He was staring into a mirror he didn't like. And here's the twist that no one in that diner could have predicted. Instead of storming out, instead of throwing money on the table to reassert dominance, he stayed. For the first time, he realized that maybe money wasn't the currency that mattered most in this world. Maybe it was something rarer, something he couldn't buy, respect. What he didn't know was that this moment, this silent duel between pride and humility, would set into motion a chain of events that neither of them could have foreseen. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions don't start in boardrooms or on stages. They start in diners, with whispered words that tear open the fragile fabric of arrogance. To truly understand the weight behind that whispered word, you need to understand her life, the battles no one saw, the sacrifices she carried like invisible armor. Growing up, she had learned early that the world didn't owe her a seat at any table, literally or figuratively. Her mother cleaned offices long into the night, and her father worked double shifts in factories, leaving her to navigate the silence of small apartments filled with the hum of survival. She learned to be observant, to read more than words, to see more than appearances. Every glance, every tone of voice, every subtle gesture became a lesson in human nature. She noticed patterns others ignored, the way people unconsciously ranked each other, the way privilege could shield ignorance, and the invisible barriers that seemed insurmountable if you didn't know the codes. Languages became her escape and her weapon. She devoured Mandarin books at the community center, mimicked the tones and rhythms until they rolled off her tongue naturally. French came next, then Spanish. Each language was more than words. It was a key, a shield, a silent message that she could navigate the worlds that tried to exclude her. Yet despite her talent, opportunities were rare. People admired the skill but overlooked the person. She worked long shifts at cafes and restaurants not because she wanted to, but because survival demanded it. The world had tried to teach her humility the wrong way, through condescension, microaggressions, and small indignities that accumulate over time. But she had learned a different lesson. Dignity doesn't demand vengeance. Strength doesn't require raising your voice. True power is often quiet, almost imperceptible, revealed in the moment you choose to act, not out of spite but out of principle. That night in the restaurant, when the millionaire mocked her in Mandarin, she recognized it for what it was. An attempt to assert dominance through ignorance, to belittle someone he assumed couldn't understand. But she had learned a lifetime of preparation for moments like this. With a single word, carefully chosen and whispered, she did not humiliate him for sport. She reminded him and everyone at the table that arrogance has limits, that dignity is a shield no amount of money can pierce. Her life had been a series of silent battles. Every act of restraint, every calculated choice to respond with composure rather than anger, had been a strategy to survive, to protect herself, to assert control where the world tried to take it away. And tonight, she exercised that strategy with perfect precision. It wasn't vengeance she sought, it never was. Vengeance is a fleeting satisfaction, a temporary imbalance. She valued something far more enduring: respect, integrity, the quiet knowledge that one's self-worth is never dependent on the approval or disapproval of others. The millionaire's discomfort was not her triumph. Her triumph was that she remained true to herself, that she did not surrender to the expectations of society, the assumptions of strangers, or the arrogance of those who believed power was measured by wealth. In that moment, she embodied a truth few people experience: that dignity is a force, subtle yet undeniable, that can alter the balance of any situation, even one dominated by money and influence. And in choosing this path, she didn't just defend herself, she illuminated a larger lesson for everyone present. Real power is often quiet, deliberate, and unassailable, because it arises from the depth of one's character rather than the superficiality of one's status. By now, the millionaire had been sitting in that restaurant long enough to feel the weight of the evening pressing on him like gravity. He realized, in a way that no amount of money or influence could shield him from, that this wasn't about arrogance, status, or ego. It was about truth. A truth he hadn't wanted to face. The waitress, calm and composed, had reminded him that respect is earned, that no empire of wealth could buy the kind of dignity she carried effortlessly. He glanced around, noticing the subtle shifts in the room. Waiters, diners, even his own companions were no longer paying attention to him. They were watching her. The power dynamics had changed quietly, irrevocably. He understood then that his smile had disappeared not because of humiliation alone, but because he had glimpsed a reality he had ignored for years. True strength comes from resilience, intelligence, and the courage to remain dignified when the world expects submission. The millionaire swallowed hard. Pride is a heavy burden, and tonight it had been exposed as fragile. The word she whispered in Mandarin wasn't just a word. It was a mirror reflecting the parts of himself he had buried beneath arrogance and wealth. And now, facing that reflection, he realized something critical. The only way forward was not to strike back, not to assert control, but to listen, to learn, and perhaps to respect. The waitress approached one last time, handing him the bill with the same composed grace she had maintained all evening. He wanted to say something clever, to reclaim a shred of superiority, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a recognition that a lesson had been learned, not through confrontation, but through quiet strength. As she walked away, the energy in the restaurant shifted once more. People returned to their meals, but the atmosphere was charged differently. They had witnessed something rare, a moment where dignity, preparation, and intelligence outweighed arrogance and assumed power. And everyone who had been present understood something without needing translation. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. For the waitress, it was another day. She returned to her routine, no fanfare, no announcement, carrying herself with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth. The world may try to define you, to limit you, to belittle you, but she had proven that true dignity can never be taken away, and that the smallest actions can ripple into the lives of everyone around you. The millionaire, however, left with a lesson that would linger. Money couldn't rewrite the past, arrogance couldn't silence truth, and a single, carefully chosen word had reminded him that respect is not a commodity. It is a responsibility. And that's the final truth of the story. Sometimes, it takes someone the world underestimates to teach the ones who believe they are untouchable that power is not measured in wealth, but in character. If the story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment below. Share your thoughts on how a single act of courage can change everything. And remember, no matter your position in life, dignity is something no one can take from you. So always choose to rise with strength and grace.